part I keep coming back to isn't the money. It isn't the moment she handed me the check, or the way her assistant nearly dropped his coffee when he saw the number I wrote on the invoice. What I keep coming back to is the look on my daughter's face when I picked her up from school that afternoon. The way she ran across the parking lot with her backpack bouncing and her braids flying, and how she stopped dead when she saw what was parked at the curb behind my truck. "Daddy," she said, "whose house is that?" She meant the car. I told her it was just something I was returning to somebody. She looked at it for another second, then she looked at me and she said, "Did you fix it?" I said, "Yeah, I fixed it." She nodded, like that was the most obvious thing in the world. Like, of course I fixed it, like there was never any question. That was the moment, not the bet, not the repair, not any of it, that right there. Her name is Ivy, and she's 8 years old, and she is the reason I get up at 5 in the morning 6 days a week and drive a truck that has 230,000 miles on it and has never once, not one single time, let me down. My name is Todd Mercer. I'm a licensed plumber out of Knoxville, Tennessee. I've been doing this work for going on 22 years, started as an apprentice the summer after I graduated high school, worked my way up, got my master's license at 26, and opened my own one-man operation about 9 years ago. I'm not a company. I don't have a fleet. I have a truck, a trailer, a good set of tools, and a reputation that I have spent 2 decades earning one job at a time. I do residential and light commercial, mostly older homes. The kind of work nobody else wants because the pipes are galvanized or cast iron and you have to actually know what you're looking at instead of just swapping parts and billing by the hour. I charge fair. I show up on time. I don't invent problems to pad an invoice, and I don't leave a job until the thing is right. Ivy's mother left when Ivy was 2. I'm not going to go into the details of that because they don't matter to this story and they don't matter to my life anymore. What matters is that I've had Ivy full time since she was 3. And every decision I have made since then, every job I've taken, every job I've turned down, every night I've stayed up reading the same picture book for the 14th time, has been made with her in mind. That's just who I am. That's the whole thing, really. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was already out at a job in West Knoxville, replacing a corroded main shutoff for a retired couple whose house had been built in 1971 and whose plumbing had not been meaningfully touched since about 1983. Good work. Honest work. The kind where you leave and you know the family is going to sleep better that night. My phone rang at 9:47. Unknown number, area code I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Sandra, and she said she was calling on behalf of her employer, who had a property in the Sequoia Hills neighborhood and a plumbing situation that had become, her word, urgent. She asked if I could come out that afternoon for an assessment. I said I could. She gave me the address, and I didn't think much of it until I pulled up. Sequoia Hills is the old money neighborhood in Knoxville. The houses there sit on the river, and they have the kind of quiet to them that only comes from serious insulation, both literal and financial. I had done work in Sequoia Hills before, a kitchen renovation here, a burst pipe there, and I knew the general landscape. Nice houses, careful people, old driveways lined with oak trees that have been there longer than anyone living in the house. The address Sandra gave me was not the biggest house on the street. It was, however, the most impressive, set back from the road behind a stone wall with a circular drive and a fountain that was not running because it was March, and a front door that I estimated at about 10 feet tall, the kind of house that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. I parked my truck on the street. I almost moved it up the drive and then decided against it. Force of habit. You don't park the work truck in the circular drive at a place like this unless someone specifically tells you to. Sandra met me at the door. She was brisk and professional and led me through an entrance hall that had a chandelier, the size of my bathroom and floors, that I recognized immediately as reclaimed heart pine. Old growth, probably salvaged, the kind of wood you genuinely cannot buy anymore. She said the owner would be with me shortly and showed me to a sitting room off the main hall. I stood. I didn't sit. I was in work clothes and my boots were clean, but they were still boots, and the furniture in that room looked like it belonged in a museum. The owner came in about 4 minutes later. Her name, I would learn, was Catherine Lund. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with silver hair cut very short, in the kind of posture that takes either decades of ballet or decades of being the most important person in every room she enters. She was wearing a cashmere sweater and wool trousers and no jewelry except for a single ring on her right hand that I did not look at long enough to evaluate. She shook my hand. Her handshake was firm. She said, "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming on short notice." I said it wasn't a problem. She said, "I have a situation downstairs that 3 different contractors have looked at in the past 2 months, and none of them have been able to resolve. I want you to understand that before we get into it, because I want you to know that I am not someone who jumps to the phone at the first sign of trouble. I have already paid, in assessment fees alone, more than $12,000 to people who told me things that turned out to be wrong." I said, "Tell me what they told you." She told me. The first contractor had said the issue was the main drain stack. Old cast iron, probably cracked somewhere in the wall, would need to be opened up and replaced. Estimate, $48,000. The second contractor agreed it was the drain stack, but added that the subfloor on the lower level showed signs of long-term moisture intrusion and would need to be addressed at the same time. New estimate, $71,000. The third contractor, a company out of Nashville that Catherine had brought in specifically because they specialized in historic properties, had told her the entire lower-level plumbing system needed to be replaced, that the house's original 1920s cast iron was beyond salvage, and that while they were at it she should consider repiping the upper floors as well. Their estimate was $138,000, and they had asked for 40% up front. She had not paid the 40%. Instead, she had asked Sandra to find someone else. Sandra had found me through a referral from a woman named Patricia Eldridge, whose kitchen I had repapied the previous fall, and who had, apparently, told Sandra that I was the only plumber she had ever worked with who actually fixed the problem on the first try. I appreciated Patricia for that. Catherine finished laying out the history and then looked at me with an expression that was not hostile but was also not warm. It was the expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times to have stopped assuming good faith. She said, "Before you go downstairs, I want to be direct with you. I've been told a lot of things about what is wrong with this house. I don't know which of those things are true. What I do know is that the water pressure in my lower level has been dropping intermittently for 4 months, that there is an odor that comes and goes in the utility room, and that my previous plumbers have all agreed there is a problem somewhere in the cast iron, but none of them have agreed on where." I said, "Can I ask you something?" She said yes. I said, "Did any of them run a smoke test?" She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I don't know what that is." A smoke test is exactly what it sounds like. You introduce non-toxic theatrical smoke into a drain system under light pressure, and then you watch where it comes out. If your stack is cracked, the smoke finds it. If you've got a failed wax ring somewhere, the smoke finds it. If there's a dry P-trap letting sewer gas back into the house, the smoke finds that too. It is not a new technique. It is not complicated. It costs almost nothing to perform. I went downstairs and spent the first 20 minutes just looking, not testing, not touching, looking. I looked at how the pipes ran, where they connected, what era the fittings were from. The cast iron was old, but it was not, to my eye, in the distressed condition the previous contractors had described. Old iron develops a certain look when it's failing. A pitting, a weeping, a darkness around the joints. What I was looking at showed age, but not failure. I looked at the utility room. I looked at the floor drain. I looked at the vent stack where it came through the ceiling. And then I found it. There was a clean-out cap on the main stack, a 3-inch cap threaded, probably original to the house, which meant it was somewhere close to 100 years old, and someone, at some point, had over-tightened it. The threads were stripped. The cap was not sealing. It was sitting in place well enough to fool a visual inspection, but it was not actually sealing. Every time the system pressurized, every time someone flushed a toilet or ran a full tub, sewer gas was pushing past that cap into the utility room. The pressure drop they'd been seeing wasn't a crack, it was this. Just this. I went back upstairs. Catherine was in the kitchen. She had a cup of tea, and she was standing at the island looking at something on her phone. She looked up when I came in. I said, "I think I found it." She said, "Which part?" I said, "One part." I told her what I had found. I told her about the clean-out cap, about the stripped threads, about the sewer gas. I told her that I couldn't make her any promises until I'd run the smoke test to confirm there wasn't something else going on further up the line, but that, in my professional opinion, the previous contractors had all been so focused on the cast iron that they had walked right past the actual problem. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "The cap." I said, "Yes." She said, "What does a new cap cost?" I said, "About $4. The fitting I'd want to use to make it serviceable going forward is maybe $12 total, an hour of my time." She set down her tea. She said, "Mr. Mercer, I want to make you a proposition." I should say here that I almost said no. Not because the proposition wasn't reasonable, but because I am by nature a cautious man. I have a daughter who depends on me and a business that depends on my reputation, and I have learned over 22 years that the jobs that start with dramatic propositions have a way of becoming complicated in ways that are not always worth it. But I listened. Catherine Wund, it turned out, was the founder and recently retired CEO of a logistics company that she had built from a regional operation in the late 1990s into one of the largest privately held freight networks in the southeastern United States. She had sold the company 3 years ago for a number I won't repeat because it is not my number to repeat, but it was the kind of number that explains the house and the chandelier and the heart pine floors. She was also, she told me, deeply tired of being told things that turned out not to be true. She said, "I will pay you your standard rate for today's assessment and for whatever repair work you end up doing, but I want to make a separate arrangement. If your diagnosis is correct, if that cap is the source of the problem and the smoke test confirms nothing else is seriously wrong, I want to hire you as my property plumber for the next 3 years. This house, my cabin up on Norris Lake, and a commercial space I own downtown. First write a refusal on everything. I'll pay a retainer." I said, "What's the retainer?" She named a number. I kept my face neutral. I'm good at keeping my face neutral. I said I would need to think about it, and she said, of course, and we agreed I would do the repair and the smoke test, and we would talk again after. I went back downstairs. I pulled the clean-out cap with a pipe wrench. It came off in about 30 seconds. The threads were stripped clean, you could see the wear clearly. I went out to my truck and found the fitting I wanted. A new PVC clean-out with a rubber gasket and a threaded cap that would give whoever came after me a clean, serviceable access point instead of this 100-year-old iron time bomb. The fitting cost me, at my supplier's rate, $11.40. I had it installed in 40 minutes. Then I ran the smoke test. I watched the smoke move through the system. I watched it rise in the places it was supposed to rise, and I watched for the places it wasn't supposed to appear. I walked the lower level slowly, flashlight in hand, checking every joint and every connection and every point where the old system interfaced with the newer sections that had been added in various renovations over the decades. The smoke came out at the vent cap on the roof. It came out at the clean-out I had just replaced. It came out at the 2 floor drains when I checked them, which is exactly right. It did not come out anywhere else. The cast iron stack was fine. The subfloor showed no active moisture intrusion. The stack connections were solid and dry and had probably another 30 or 40 years in them if the house was maintained properly. I ran the test twice. Same result. I went back upstairs and found Catherine in the sitting room. She had moved in there while I was working, and she was reading, an actual book, not a phone, and she looked up when I came in with an expression that was practiced in not revealing too much. I said, "The cap was it." She looked at me. I said, "The rest of your system is in good condition. The cast iron has some age to it, but there's no active cracking, no evidence of failure at the joints. Your subfloor is dry. The odor was sewer gas coming through that stripped fitting, and the pressure drop was related to the same seal failure. You do not need a new stack. You do not need a new subfloor. You need, and I want to be precise about this, an $11 fitting and about an hour of labor." She closed the book. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said very quietly, 4 months. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, 3 contractors. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, $12,000 in assessment fees. I said, "I'm sorry. I truly am. I don't know what they were looking at. The stripped threads were visible on direct inspection. I don't have a charitable explanation for why they missed it." She nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are containing something they are not going to say. Then she said, "The retainer offer stands. I'd like to add something to it." She said she wanted to refer me to 3 people. Personal referrals. Her words, not an online review, not a mention in a neighborhood group. 3 phone calls she would make herself, to people she knew who owned properties in Knoxville and the surrounding area and who she believed would become long-term clients if I did for them what I had just done for her. I said, "You don't need to do that." She said, "I know I don't need to. I want to." I said I appreciated it. She said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Sure." She said, "You have a daughter." It wasn't a question. I had a picture of Ivy on my keyring, one of those little acrylic tags, her school photo from 2nd grade, and I had set my keys on the entry table when I came in, because I always take my keys out of my pocket when I'm working so they don't scratch things. Catherine must have seen it. I said, "I do, she's 8, her name's Ivy." Catherine looked at the window for a moment. She said, "My daughter is 31. We have not spoken in 2 years. It is—" She stopped. She picked up her book and set it back down. "It is the thing in my life that I would trade everything in this house to fix, and I cannot find the right fitting for it. I can't even find the right diagnosis." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She said, "I'm sorry, that was an overshare." I said, "No, it wasn't." We sat there for a moment in the quiet of that room, with the late afternoon light coming through the tall windows and the sound of the fountain outside that was not running, and I thought about Ivy running across the school parking lot with her backpack bouncing. And I thought about how the most important things are almost never the expensive things, and almost always the things that are right in front of you that nobody is bothering to look at correctly. I wrote the invoice that evening. An hour and 15 minutes of labor at my standard rate, plus materials, plus the assessment fee she'd agreed to at the start. The total was $212. Sandra called me the next morning and asked if I had made an error. I said I had not. There was a pause. Sandra said she would need to discuss this with Ms. Lund. I said that was fine. Catherine called me herself about an hour later. She said, "Mr. Mercer, your invoice is for $212. I said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to pay you more than that." I said, "I appreciate that, but $212 is what the job cost." She said, "I've spent $12,000 on people who didn't find the problem. You found it in 20 minutes. I said, "I understand, but I can't charge you for other people's time. I can only charge you for mine." There was a long pause. She said, "You're going to be impossible to work with, aren't you?" I said, "My previous clients might say I'm thorough. I don't think any of them have said impossible." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh, and it was a good laugh. Real, little surprised, like she hadn't expected it to come out. She said, "I'm paying the invoice and adding a tip. I will not be argued out of the tip. Don't try." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "The 3 referrals. I've already made the calls. You should be hearing from a man named Donovan by end of week. He has a 1940s Tudor on Cherokee Boulevard, and I told him you were the only person I'd trust in a house that old." I thanked her. She said, "Thank Ivy for sharing her father for an afternoon." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said I would. I picked Ivy up from school at 3:15. She came running across the parking lot the way she always does, backpack bouncing, braids flying, sneakers that light up when she runs because she picked them out herself, and I told her she could have whatever sneakers she wanted as long as they fit properly. She stopped when she saw the car at the curb behind my truck. Catherine had asked Sandra to arrange for me to have it driven back, and the detail they'd sent over was a black Mercedes SUV, 7 Series, with a man in a dark jacket standing next to it. Ivy stared at it. She said, "Daddy, whose house is that?" I said it was just something I was returning to somebody. She looked at it for another second, then she looked at me. She said, "Did you fix it?" I said, "Yeah, I fixed it." She nodded, absolute certainty, like of course I did. She took my hand and we walked to our truck, which was parked behind the Mercedes and which had 230,000 miles on it, and a crack in the passenger side mirror and a Little League sticker on the back window that Ivy had put there in October, and which I had not removed because she had been so proud of putting it exactly straight. We drove home. We made spaghetti. We watched 30 minutes of a nature documentary about deep-sea fish, which Ivy is currently obsessed with, because her science teacher told the class about bioluminescence, and Ivy has not stopped thinking about it since. At bedtime, she asked me what I had done that day. I told her I had fixed a drain at a big house. She asked if it was hard. I thought about the 4 months, and the 3 contractors and the $12,000 in assessment fees, and the strict clean-out cap that nobody had bothered to pull. I said, "Not really, you just have to know what you're looking for." She said, "Is that what you always do? Look for the right thing." I said, "I try." She thought about that. She said, "I think you're pretty good at it, Daddy." Then she pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes, and I sat on the edge of her bed for another minute in the dark, just listening to her breathe, thinking that there is no credential in the world that means as much as that. A kid who believes you know how to find what's broken and fix it. That's the whole job when it comes down to it. Every single time. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that day in Catherine's house, not the repair itself. That part was straightforward once I slowed down enough to actually look. What I keep turning over is why 3 other people didn't. They weren't bad at their jobs. They probably knew more about high-end plumbing systems than I do. But they walked into that utility room with an answer already forming, and the answer they were forming was expensive. And once that happens, you stop seeing what's actually there. You see what confirms what you already decided. The stripped cap was right in front of them, 100 years old, sitting slightly crooked, threads worn clean, and they looked past it every single time. I think about that whenever Ivy asks me how I find things that are broken. The honest answer is, I don't start by knowing what's wrong. I start by being willing to not know. There's a difference between those two things, and it took me a long time to understand it. Certainty before observation is just expensive guessing, and in my line of work, the customer pays for that guessing whether they know it or not. What Catherine paid $12,000 for was the confidence of people who had stopped asking questions. What she paid me $212 for was the hour I spent actually looking. I'm not saying that to make myself sound clever. I'm saying it because I think it's the most important thing I know about doing honest work. You have to be more committed to finding the truth than to proving you already knew it. That takes something that I don't think can be taught in a classroom. It's a kind of discipline, the willingness to set down what you assume and pick up what's actually in front of you. I've had to practice it my whole career. There are days I get it wrong, days I walk into a job with a theory and have to catch myself mid-diagnosis and back up. It's uncomfortable every time, but the discomfort is the point. It's the signal that you're doing the work honestly instead of just efficiently. And then there's the other thing, the staying power. I've been doing this for 22 years. I've had slow months and hard years, and jobs that cost me more than they paid, and customers who never called back, and equipment that broke at the worst possible times. What kept me going wasn't passion exactly. It was something quieter. It was the knowledge that the work was real, that it mattered, that when I left a house the family inside it was going to be okay. That is enough. That has always been enough. Ivy doesn't know any of this yet. She just knows that Daddy fixes things, but someday she'll understand that the fixing isn't really about the pipes or the fittings or the $11 cap. It's about showing up with honest eyes and a steady hand and the willingness to do the job right even when nobody is watching. That's the whole inheritance I have to give her. I intend to make it worth something.